Welcome to this Getting Started with SharePoint Framework Extensions tutorial series. And in this tutorial, we're looking into how do we create our very first field customizer extension. Field customizers can be used to render or modify the rendering of a field within a SharePoint list or within a SharePoint library. And you can then embed JavaScript and any other experiences for end users using the field customizer extension model. This video has been recorded in February 2020, and it's using SharePoint Framework version 1.10. So if you're watching the video later on, there might be small adjustments on the guidance and steps and code even. So please always have a look on the written tutorial format and the written tutorial guidance, which is always kept up to date. And the videos are updated slightly more infrequently. Now, let's actually get right into it. And I'm going to go to my Windows 10 machine, which I've been using across all of the tutorials, which we updated for SharePoint Framework 1.10 release. And let me actually go to the folder where I'm actually storing my solutions. So in my case, I'm using C code. It doesn't really matter where you're actually putting your solutions. And let's actually start walking through the steps within the tutorial. So first of all, we are being requested to create a field customizer folder, field extension. Let me be precise and follow up on the actual written guidance, and like we just requested you to do as well. And I'm going to go to the field extension folder, and in here, let's actually clean up something and execute the Yo Microsoft SharePoint. So the Yeoman generator for SharePoint Framework 1.10 in this case, because we're running SharePoint Framework 1.10 version. And we're going to create and scaffold the basic structure of the solution. So with the kind of a default settings as well. So we're not really doing any big modifications in here. We're going to use the default value. We're going to target SharePoint Online. Well, now, if we are creating field customizers, they are supported in SharePoint 2019, but not in SharePoint 2016. So if you choose SharePoint 2016, the extension option is not visible. But in our case, we're going to choose SharePoint Online. We're going to use the current folder, and we're going to say no to the tenant-wide deployment option. And we're going to say no to a unique permissions. And we are building an extension, and we are building a field customizer extension. And we can use the default values here, so the hello world and hello world description. Technically, in the case of extensions, these are not really visible anywhere within the UI. So if you're building a web part, and the title and description has much more sense. And there's the default scaffolding options for no JavaScript framework or React, but you can absolutely use whatever JavaScript framework you prefer. And these are just the default scaffolding options where we are then injecting, for example, in this case, the React settings in, but you can use Angular, Vue.js, Ember, whatever is your preferred chosen option by selecting no JavaScript framework like we do today, and then including those NPM packages and whatever configurations you want within the solution. So there's no limitations on SharePoint Framework on which SharePoint Framework, JavaScript framework you want to actually use or not. Now, let's again speed up the video to catch up on the moment when the scaffolding is fully completed. And there we go. Now the solution structure has been scaffolded, and let's clean up the folder slightly or the console slightly, and let's start our Visual Studio Code. So the basic structure obviously is exactly the same like with any solution structures within the SharePoint framework. So you can actually see that the folder structure is intact or looking exactly like it is for web parts as well. For extensions, we always also include the elements XML file in the SharePoint and assets folder, like in this case as well, because it helps actually the provisioning of that extension to an existing site. Now, like in the case of web parts, we do obviously have a manifest file for our extensions, and manifest file is defining the extension identifier, the uniqueness of the extension, and then the component type, and also the potential additional settings. Now, all of this is looking pretty much the same as within the web parts, but in the case of extensions, the manifest file doesn't really actually define where it's being exposed and where it's being defined or surfaced. It's a slightly different perspective or slightly different behavior from that perspective. Now, on the actual code file, we can see that obviously we have the base field customizer here, where we're getting all of the basics, and we're extending that one. The basic setup is quite simple, actually. We are just just logging in the console that we are activating our extension. Quite a good thing always to go through, so testing that things are working properly, and then before you're packaging your code, getting rid of these potentially, or based on switches and all of that will basically modify, you could modify those things. Now, the most important here, the most important thing actually related on overriding the rendering of the field value in the read-only mode is basically on render cell. So in here we're getting the field value, and then it's up to us. We basically have access on the event DOM element to modify the rendering, and we can do whatever we want. We can include as complex scenarios and rendering here as we want, or you can just add the field value with an additional value, or you can do, well, technically there's no limitations on what you can do. As long as you go to that DOM element and modify that DOM element, you don't actually start modifying the page DOM element, you modify the DOM elements which are actually received in the extension level. Now, before we actually go forward on doing things, let's go to our site, which we're going to use for testing this stuff. So let me go to sites and group, which is the one which I'm using in my tests. And in here, I'm going to actually create orders list, which we're going to use then for testing things up. So let's actually do that. So let me go to new lists, and in here we're going to actually create a new list, and let's give it a name, orders, and it's a pretty big dialog. So I'm going to click to create on the top right corner, so bottom right corner. And in here, we actually want to add one more field. So let's, or column, let's add a column here, which is a number field or a number type. So let's actually give this name as %, which we cannot then target our custom experience, and all of the other things we can leave as they are. So it's not a massive, well, the other settings in this case are not actually that impactful. Let's actually add a few items here. I'm going to switch to quick edit just for the sake of it, so I can more easily actually render these things. Let's call that item A and give it a value of 10. Let's call that item B and give it a value of 50. And let's call that item C and give it a value of 90. And there we go. And exit quick edits. And we can actually see now the values being rendered on the list as such. So here we go, item A, B, C, and values 10, 50, 90. Now, we want to test our extension against this live sites, and that's one thing with the extensions, you cannot actually test them using the local workbench or the online workbench. So you need to test them against the live site, and to be able to do that, there's a serve.json file within the solution, which we're going to use for the configuration. So you don't have to worry about how to come up with a custom debugging URLs, and I'll come back on that one in a second. But we're going to take the URL from there. We're going to go back on the solution structure. We're going to go back on the config file, opening up serve.json, and we can see the default configuration in here using the Contoso. So I'm going to actually change this one, point to the all items ASPX file, or the URL. And then we can actually see here that we are associating an extension with a this ID with a sample text of value, but we're associating this to a field called internal field name. So let's actually fix this one as to be called as %, because that is actually the internal file field name for that particular field which we just created. So that's going to use by default when you're creating the field in the list, the % field. Let me get back in here. It's going to use the same name as the internal field name. So I know that it's % in this case. Saving the changes, and that means that we can now test out things. So I could actually go to the console, obviously, or I could actually start a terminal here. Really up to your preference. What do you want to do, and where do you want to actually work with the console? But I'm going to do cop serve from here. And what's going to now happen, obviously, we've probably seen this if we went through the first 4 tutorials on the extensions series. We can actually spin up a browser. We can then ask, are you sure you want to load the debugging scripts? And in this case, we do know what we're doing, and we are being the developer, so we're going to actually load debugging scripts. And what actually happened here is that we set the URL of the browser to use debug manifest file. We're pointing to local host. We have here custom query parameters, which are basically telling for SharePoint that, hey, SharePoint, load an additional JavaScript file from the local host on top of this existing list. And that then makes sure that our custom code, let's go back on our code and have a look on what our code is actually doing. What the code is doing is that we are getting the field value. We also are getting the properties and sample text, which is the properties of the extension. And we're basically adding that to a text field, which we are then rendering in the DOM element. So what is that properties sample text? Well, that's the properties of the extension. So we do have a properties in this extension called sample text, and that means that we can actually parameterize that instance. So in here, we are able to say properties and sample text equals, let's go value in here, equals value. And the same way, where did that came from? Let's go back on the serve.json. We can actually see that there's a properties and sample text equal value. So we're kind of a mimicking situation where the user custom or the extension would be associated to the list given the property sample text having this value. So you're able to kind of parameterize the instance of the extension in that field in a list. And we'll get back on all of that later on the tutorial as well. Cool. So that's how we actually got here the value. Let me actually get. That's what we actually started. There we go. So that's the URL without the query parameters, and we can say that the percent value is 10, 50, 90. But this is the with the query parameters, which is then basically loading also the extension. So loading the extension together with the out-of-the-box experience, and now we're rendering the output with the value equals 10. So that was the text, which we again created in the code in here. So that's where we actually generated that combination. So quite simple, actually, quite simple setup. So let's actually modify that experience slightly. So let's modify the field rendering to make some slightly more sense than just having a value. So let's actually open up the module CSS, so the styling in here. And in the hello world, inside of the hello world, I'm going to actually modify the settings slightly. So I'm going to use a cell and a full, and the background color being that value, and the white setting. So we're going to see what it means in a practice. And on the render cell, let me actually modify that one slightly as well. So we're going to modify what are we rendering in the render cell. So I'm going to actually remove all of this stuff from here, and I'm going to paste in what we're doing here. So we're kind of building a div structure and using the styles, the full style and the hello world and well, actually, yeah, the cell style over there, the render values, and actually the width of that div will be based on the field value. So we're basically then drawing a graph of the div with a background color, which is indicating the width, and we're outputting also the field value and the actual number, which is of the field. So let's actually test this out. So I'm going to break the rendering. I could break the rendering and do a observe, or I can actually go in here and reload the page as well and load debug scripts, and we should see the indication and the change behavior, and we actually can see that. So as you can see, we're drawing that 10% as a 10%, that's a 50% of the bar, and that's a 90% of the bar. So kind of modifying the experience from there. And sure, if you are familiar with column formatting and list formatting, you can actually achieve similar kind of things using column formatting and list formatting without code, so with low code experience with JSON. But the difference with field customizers with SharePoint Framework is that you can actually include JavaScript here. So you might have a button clicks, you might have actions, you might have much more complex rendering here as well. So you might, if I click this one, you might open up a module, you might open up a panel, you might open up something else, and something else happens. With JSON and the column formatting and view formatting, you cannot embed custom code. So there's no supported way for adding scripts and custom code on that experience. So that's really the main difference between the field customizer and the column and the list formatting. Now let's actually go through and deploy this completely, so we don't have to use the debug manifest file definition. So let me actually break up the rendering here. Let me go to the elements folder. SharePoint elements folder here, our assets folder, where we have the elements XML. And what we're doing here is that we are defining a new field called SPFX percentage with the display name percentage to be included, to be available in a site where we will be deploying this solution. So as part of the solution deployment, we are actually provisioning also a field to that site with these given values. And the main point here is the client-side component ID. So all of the fields, objects in SharePoint has the client-side component ID property, and we have there a unique GUID. And of course, that is the unique GUID of our extension. So that basically means for SharePoint is that whenever this field is being rendered in the UX of SharePoint, the SharePoint is trying to find that, hey, there should be now a component available, SharePoint Framework component available in my context, hosted in from the app catalog with this kind of an ID. And if it exists, then it's going to render that component as part of this field rendering. And that's how we basically associate then the field customizer to be rendered as part of the provisioning of the list. Now, how do we package the element XML file? So if I go back on the config file, package solution is the one which actually contains all of the configurations. If I slightly scroll down, we can actually see the basic configurations, the version, solution, file number, but we can also see that there's a feature. And inside of that feature, we have elements XML definition. So this basically makes sure that as part of our SPPKG file, the solution package file, we have created a feature XML file and elements XML file, which then automates deployment of that field, which was in the, well, open up with this field, whenever the solution is being installed on the site. So that's basically what we're doing here. So we're automating the whole process and packaging all of the assets inside of the SPPKG file. So I can send that file, solution file for somebody else, and then whenever that person adds that solution to their tenant, it's going to provision the same field to be available. Good. So we are pretty much ready to go. So let me do culp bundle does ship, which will basically package the solution in the optimal code. It will minimize the code. It will get rid of all of the additional settings. And cleaning up, running the webpack, doing all of that stuff. There we go. And then I'm going to run culp package solution --ship. And that's going to then create us an SPPKG file. So we can see the solution folder getting created in here in a second. 1, 2, 3, there we go. And we can see our solution file being generated there, which we can then install to our tenant. And the debug folder contained actually what's inside of that SPPKG file. So we can actually see that our element XML file is inside of this folder structure. And there we go. We know that this field definition to create the field whenever the SPPKG file is inside of that solution as well. Now let's actually close up things, close all, just clean up before we start installation. So let me actually reveal this in Explorer, so we can actually drag and drop to our tenant. Let me go to our apps. There we go. There's the first URL available. So let me jump over there. Let me go to apps for SharePoint. And let me drag and drop the field extension SPPKG file here. You can see I have quite a lot of other extensions and tutorial solutions available here. And we can trust that it's not a tenant deployable. So there's no checkbox to get it deployed across the tenant and deploy. And that means that it's now available to be installed to any site collection within this tenant. So let's actually do that. So let me actually close that tab, which we have the debugging structure. Let me get in here. Let's go to the front page of the site and see that everything is fine. Let me go to the site contents and we'll start the installation process. So in here, we can choose new app and then we can actually see our field extension to be available, to be selected. So in my case, I have, as I said, multiple other tutorials available as well in this tenant, so don't worry about those. But field extension client-side solution is the one which we are installing in this case, and getting that one installed on the site. So that's going to take a while to get installed, not a super long while, but it's basically making sure that then the field is installed on the site as well. So let's wait. I'm going to do a refresh until the full solution is installed. And that was actually quite fast. So that's pretty cool. So let's then create a list where we're going to then use the field which we actually provisioned. So let's call this invoices, just to differentiate that from the orders. And let me click to create. And I want to go to this list settings. So if I remember correctly, and the list settings are no longer available from the list level. So I need to be clever to get there. So let me go back on the site contents, and in the invoices, 3 dots and settings, I will get back on the list settings, the configuration of the list itself. And what I want to do is that I want to click to add from existing site columns. And this is basically showing us existing site columns which have been deployed to this site. And since, as part of the SPPKG file deployment, we actually included our custom column to be available, we can now see the SPFX columns. Wait, how did we know that it's SPFX columns? Well, we actually defined that in the XML. So in the XML file, we actually said that the group name of this group is SPFX columns. So the field is available then under the SPFX columns in here as well. So let me go one more time, SPFX columns. You can define these any way you want. So it's really up to you. And in my case, I have a few other ones here as well, and these are related on the other tutorials, but percentages here, I can add that one as a column to be added, and OK, and that's now actually added on the list. And now, if everything works as expected, let's go to the invoices list. Let's add a new item. Let's call this item A and give it a value of 35 and click Save. And as expected, our field customizer is now rendering, and because we're using asset packaging, again, the default values of SharePoint Framework Solutions is the asset packaging in here, include client-side assets. We are automatically using, automatically hosting the code, automatically hosting the JavaScript files for you, so you don't have to worry about CDN or external hosting and all of that additional operation. So super simple thing, will automatically host the JavaScript for you. If you have enabled Office 365 CDN on this tenant, then we'll serve actually that automatically using CDN. If it don't have the CDN enabled, we're going to serve that through outside of the CDN. So CDN just improves the performance. It doesn't actually, it is not a pre-requirement for any of the SharePoint Framework capabilities. Now, just to follow up on making the experience look exactly like it is in the tutorial or in written tutorial, we can actually test out a few different values. And let's add one more there. So you can actually see that it's looking exactly like we were planning based on the written guidance. But pretty cool setup, and like I said, you can achieve similar kind of rendering techniques using the column formatting, using the view formatting. But in this case, we didn't go that far, but SharePoint Framework and field customizers support you to actually add JavaScript, actionable JavaScript. You could have buttons, clicks, actions, and real JavaScript hosted in here. Because again, your tenant administrator is actually controlling, is that solution getting deployed to the tenant, and you have the tenant or app catalog manager approving the extension. And that's why we allow then JavaScript being embedded on the site. So there is that governance level of support and control, and centralized ways also for disabling the functionality if needed from the app catalog. So that's the additional governance with SharePoint Framework. But that's it for this tutorial. Hopefully you'll find the capability interesting. Thank you for following up.